I'm Brandon Hayes. I'm 34, single, and living in a high-rise condo overlooking Seattle's skyline. Last year, I sold my software company for $5 million, enough to let me retire early, travel the world, or do absolutely nothing for the rest of my life. But with that kind of peace, you start hearing the echoes you've long buried. For me, it was the voice of my father, Victor Hayes. Not warm, not kind, just cold, demanding, calculating. Always asking how much, never how are you. If you looked at our family from the outside, you'd see a well-dressed man, once a successful real estate mogul, and his fortunate son who hit it big. But if you listened closely, you'd hear something darker, something poisoned. Today was my mother's 60th birthday, Lillian Hayes, the light in our home, and the only reason I still showed up at that old suburban house near San Francisco. I was slipping into a dark green shirt, the one she always said brought out my eyes. I glanced in the mirror and forced a smile. That was the easy part. The hard part was pretending I didn't remember what Victor had done to me as a child. The bruises, the sudden backhands when the liquor hit him harder than expected, the silence after. He never apologized, never changed, just turned the abuse into emotional blackmail as I grew up. Now that I was rich, I was just a bank account with legs. I drove down the tree-lined roads in my BMW, the autumn sun flashing through the windshield. Jazz played on the radio, something my mother loved. I tried to let the music wash over the dread, but it didn't work. Not today. When I arrived, she was already at the door. "Brandon, you made it." Lillian smiled, wrapping her arms around me. She smelled like lavender and warm pie. It almost made me forget why I hated this house. The backyard was dressed for celebration, strings of lights, silver-rimmed tables, a soft jazz trio tucked in the corner. Lillian stood radiant in a champagne shawl, silver hair pinned neatly. A few relatives mingled, Aunt Elaine, Uncle Martin, neighbors I barely recognized, and then there was him. Victor stood in the far corner with a wineglass in hand, looking like he belonged on the cover of a real estate magazine. Silver hair, charcoal suit, that smug little smirk that meant he was watching, always watching. He raised his glass when our eyes met. I nodded politely, avoiding the twist in my stomach. I wandered toward the dessert table when his voice cut through the chatter. "Brandon," he said, loud enough for heads to turn. "Join me for a drink, son. I've poured something special." That word special landed wrong, like a gunshot muffled by velvet. He handed me a glass of red wine, its deep color swirling in the sunlight. "To you," he said, raising his own. "My brilliant son." I took a sip. It tasted bitter, but I chalked it up to the expensive stuff he always bragged about. My mother was laughing nearby with Elaine. I didn't want to alarm her. I smiled, nodded, and kept drinking. Then the world started to tilt. Voices stretched like taffy, spinning around me in echoes. My heart thundered against my ribs. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to reach for my mother, her silhouette blurred like smoke. My glass slipped from my fingers and shattered in the grass. Darkness took over. I woke up in the dim upstairs bedroom of the house I once called home, the same room I'd hidden in as a boy, while my father's rage echoed through the halls. But now it was quiet, too quiet. My head felt like it had been split open and sewn back together. My arms were weak, my legs numb. The smell of lavender lingered. My mother, "Brandon," she whispered, perched on the edge of the bed, clutching my hand like she might lose me. Her voice cracked. "God, you scared me." "What happened?" "You collapsed," she said, brushing my hair back like she used to. "In the garden. Your father said you drank too much. One glass. That's all I had. One sip and I went down like a domino." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Doubt. "You didn't drink much, did you?" she asked, quieter now. I shook my head slowly. "Just the glass he gave me." She looked away. Her hands trembled in her lap. "I've seen this before," she said, almost to herself. "Years ago, my father, one night after a party. Same symptoms. Dizzy. Couldn't breathe. He didn't wake up the next morning." I stared at her. I barely remembered my grandfather, Samuel Whitmore. He died when I was young. The story was always heart attack. But her voice, the fear in it, said she never fully believed that. "You think it wasn't natural?" I asked cautiously. She stood and walked to the window, arms folded. "I don't know what to think anymore, but your father poured that drink. He emphasized it was special. And then you nearly died. Silence fell between us like a curtain, and in that moment, everything shifted. I wasn't just a suspicious son anymore. I was a man who'd survived a quiet attempt on his life, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the first time my father had done this to someone in our family. My mother turned back to me. "What are you thinking?" I clenched my jaw. "I'm going to find out the truth." She nodded once, solemnly. "Be careful, Brandon." I didn't need to be told, because if my gut was right, this wasn't just about a bad father. This was about a man capable of murder, and this time I wasn't going to play the obedient son. The days after my collapse blurred into grey. My body recovered, but my mind kept replaying that moment, the glass of wine, Victor's smirk, and the way the world spun out of control. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd dodged something far worse than fainting. Still, I had no proof, just suspicion. And suspicion, I knew, meant nothing to the world unless you could back it with evidence. Then Thanksgiving arrived. My mother called a few days before, hopeful as always. "Come home for dinner, sweetheart, just for one night." I hesitated. I didn't want to see him, didn't want to sit across from the man who might have tried to kill me. But her voice reminded me who I was doing this for. "I'll be there," I said, though the words felt like glass in my mouth. That evening I drove to the house in silence. The roads were dark, the trees bare. It felt like a scene from a thriller, and I was walking straight into the third act. The house looked the same, too warm, too fake. From the outside it was a postcard, inside it was a stage, and Victor was waiting in the wings. My mother met me at the door with a smile, but her eyes searched mine like she was checking for signs of weakness. She gave me a quick hug. "Everything's ready." I nodded. "Where is he?" "In the dining room." I walked in, and there he was. Victor sat at the head of the table, dressed in another impeccable grey suit, a glass of red wine already in his hand. He looked up with that same sharp smirk. "Brandon," he said, lifting his glass, "glad you could join us. Feeling better these days?" I stared at him. "Much better. Thanks for asking." Dinner began. Lillian served turkey, mashed potatoes, her famous green bean casserole. Aunt Elaine chatted about her new garden. Uncle Martin asked about the stock market. I answered politely, but my attention was fixed on the man at the end of the table. Then it happened. Victor stood with a grin and raised his glass. A toast to family, to resilience, and to new beginnings. He walked around the table, stopping beside me. In his hand was another glass of red wine. He handed it to me with a sparkle in his eye. "This one," he said, "is special." That word again. Special. My mother had stepped into the kitchen. The others were talking. No one was watching. This was it. I forced a smile. "Let me just grab my napkin," I said, and ducked down. In one swift motion, I swapped the glasses, mine with his, identical in every way except the content. I rose and raised the glass that was now his. He lifted the one that had been meant for me. We clinked, and he drank. At first, nothing happened. Victor sipped his wine, settled back into his chair, and launched into conversation with Uncle Martin about real estate like it was any other holiday. For a moment, I thought I'd been wrong, that maybe I was paranoid, that maybe, just maybe, I'd misjudged the man. But then, 30 minutes passed, then 45. Victor's voice wavered mid-sentence. He blinked rapidly, then rubbed his chest. His hand gripped the armrest like it was slipping away from him. "Victor?" my mother asked from across the table, alarm rising in her voice. I'm fine," he muttered, but his face had turned pale, his hands trembled. Then, with a loud clink, his wineglass hit the floor and shattered. The room froze. Victor staggered back from the table, his body jerking like he was fighting invisible chains. He reached for the table to steady himself, and missed. He collapsed to the floor, gasping, his eyes wide and vacant, his breath shallow. "Call an ambulance," I shouted, already moving around the table. My mother knelt beside him, panic flooding her face. "Victor, can you hear me?" But I wasn't looking at him like a son looks at his father. I was watching him like a man solving the final piece of a puzzle. This was it. This was confirmation. My mother looked up at me, trembling. "What's happening?" He was fine. "What's happening to him?" I hesitated, then leaned in and whispered to her. "The glass he drank from, it was meant for me." Her eyes widened and her hand flew to her mouth. What are you saying, Brandon? I swapped the glasses, Mum, on purpose, because I had to know. The ambulance arrived minutes later. The paramedics rushed in, lifting Victor onto a stretcher as he faded in and out of consciousness. He never said a word. As they wheeled him out the front door, my mother stood frozen, her hand gripping the back of a chair like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. You think he did this to you? I nodded slowly. Not just me. Grandpa, too. We need to talk, Mum. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't grief or shock that filled the air. It was something else, something colder, resolve. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed in my Seattle apartment, the events of Thanksgiving playing on repeat in my head like a broken reel of film. My father, Victor Hayes, had collapsed after drinking the wine meant for me, just like I had days earlier. Just like my grandfather, decades ago. I needed proof. Without it, all I had were accusations and ghosts. The next morning, I took the glass Victor had been drinking from, the same one I'd switched, and poured the remaining wine into a small airtight vial I had purchased years ago as part of a travel kit. Something in me had anticipated this step. Call it paranoia, call it preparation, call it survival. I drove straight to a private lab in downtown San Francisco, discreet, off the books, the kind of place where wealthy startup founders went when they needed silence more than speed. The technician, a woman named Linda with thin glasses and a no-nonsense attitude, took the vial and asked, looking for anything specific, sedatives, poisons, anything that shouldn't be in there, I said, my voice as flat as the panic I was hiding. She nodded. We'll expedite. Come back in 3 days. Those 3 days were torture. I didn't leave my apartment. I barely ate. My phone buzzed with messages from my mother. Victor was recovering slowly. The doctors didn't know what had happened. His blood work showed anomalies, but nothing conclusive. I didn't reply to her messages. Not yet. On the third morning I got the call. Mr. Hayes. Linda's voice crackled through the speaker. You'll want to come in. My hands shook as I pulled into the lab parking lot. The sun was shining, but to me the world felt grey and motionless. Inside, she handed me a printed report and pointed to a single line, barbiturate compound detected. High concentration. I stared at the word. Barbiturate. A powerful sedative, enough to induce unconsciousness, enough, in high doses, to stop a heart. Whoever gave you this, Linda said carefully, meant to knock someone out, or worse. I nodded slowly. Thank you. I appreciate your discretion. She offered a faint nod of understanding. Take care, Mr. Hayes. I walked out of that lab with the report tucked inside my coat, a smoking gun that no longer left room for denial. Victor hadn't just wanted to scare me, he wanted me gone, and now I knew why. With no wife, no children, and over $5 million in assets. If I died, it all defaulted to him. My father, the man who called me a son but treated me like an ATM. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, my heart a mix of fury and heartbreak. I should have been shattered. Instead, I felt focused. For years he'd controlled the family through fear and power. Now it was time for someone to stop him. The night was cold when I returned to my childhood home. The lights in the windows glowed warmly, but to me they looked like the eyes of a house that had been watching me all my life, silent and complicit. My mother opened the door. Brandon, she said softly. She hadn't called me that gently in a long time. Your father's resting in the living room. I nodded. We need to talk. Just him and me. She paused, searching my eyes. She must have seen it. The storm behind the calm. Without a word, she stepped aside. I walked down the hallway, past the family photos that suddenly felt like lies. Victor sat in his usual armchair, a blanket over his legs, a glass of water in his hand instead of wine. He looked up and smirked. Well, if it isn't my miracle boy, I hear you've been playing detective. I didn't answer. I pulled out the folded lab report from my coat and placed it on the coffee table in front of him. Barbiturates, I said flatly. That's what you gave me. He stared at the paper, unmoving. For a moment, I thought he'd deny it again. Instead, he sighed. You swapped the glasses. I nodded. He looked down, his hands trembling slightly. It wasn't supposed to be like that. Then how was it supposed to be? I asked, the tremor in my voice no longer fear but fury. I get a doctor to sign off on some heart issue. I had the paperwork ready. I was going to forge your will. My stomach turned. And then what? I asked. Take the inheritance. Disappear. Victor didn't answer. He just looked away. The man I once feared now looked small, like a withered leaf clinging to a tree in winter. "You were in debt," I said. "That's what this was really about." He flinched. "You knew if I died, the money came to you. No wife, no children. It all reverts back to the loving father." Victor's jaw tightened. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Brandon. I was desperate." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was tragic. "You've been hurting me since I was a child," I said. "This just makes it official." He looked up then, and I swear for the first time in my life, I saw real fear in his eyes. "You're going to the police." I didn't answer right away. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the backyard where we'd once played catch when I was a boy, before the beating started, before the bruises and excuses. I turned back to him. "No," I said, "because that would destroy Mum. But you're done." His eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said calmly, "you don't speak to me. You don't come near my mother. You don't see a single dime of my money. You disappear into whatever empty corner of this world is left for you." He slumped deeper into the chair. "And if I don't?" I stepped closer, my voice cold. "Then I go public, with the lab results, with everything. You'll rot in prison for attempted murder and fraud." Victor looked up at me, broken. There was no fight left in him. Behind me, I heard a soft sound. My mother was standing at the doorway, her hands trembling. She had heard everything. And for once, she didn't look surprised, only heartbroken. We didn't speak that night. After my father's confession, my mother sat in silence at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of untouched tea. The house, once so full of my childhood noise and his rage, now held only heavy silence. I wanted to comfort her, but what do you say to someone who just learned their husband tried to kill their son? Instead, I just sat with her. That was all I could offer. It wasn't until the following morning, as sunlight filtered weakly through the blinds, that she finally spoke. "There's something I need to tell you, Brandon," she said quietly, "about my father." I looked up. "Grandpa Samuel." She nodded, folding her hands on the table as if to steady herself. "He died suddenly, years ago. You were a boy, maybe 5. Everyone said it was a heart attack, but I always wondered." My heart thudded. "Why?" "Because," she said, her voice cracking. "The night before he died, he had dinner with us, just like we did on my birthday. And your father, he poured him a drink too, a special one." I stared at her. "You think he did this before?" Tears welled in her eyes. I never wanted to believe it. "But after what he did to you, I can't ignore it anymore." The puzzle pieces fell into place, like 1,000 bricks slamming into my chest. The way Grandpa Samuel died, sudden, no warning, no history of illness. Victor inheriting everything through marriage after his death. The pattern was all there. Only this time, he failed. I reached across the table and took her hand. "Then we have to find out the truth." She nodded slowly. "I think I know where to start." She led me upstairs to Victor's study, a room I'd only entered twice in my life, once when I was 10, and once the day I left for college. Inside was a cold, sterile office filled with untouched books, trophies from business conferences, and one steel safe tucked in the back corner. My mother knelt down and keyed in the combination, their wedding anniversary. It clicked open. Inside were stacks of documents, real estate contracts, old tax returns, insurance policies. But there, wedged between 2 thick folders, was something else, an old leather-bound notebook. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. "It was my father's," she whispered, "his journal." We sat on the carpet, our backs to the wall, flipping through the fragile, yellowing pages. My grandfather's handwriting was neat, elegant, even. Notes about daily walks, gardening, my visits as a boy, until June 12th. "Robert poured me a drink again tonight. He's been oddly insistent lately. I don't want to worry Lillian, but I'm beginning to wonder if his kindness has strings. Last week after our dinner, I felt dizzy. Strange, like something had drained me. If anything happens, I hope someone looks deeper." I looked at my mother. She covered her mouth with one hand, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. He was trying to warn us, and suddenly we both knew this was no longer about my father trying to hurt me. He had already done it once. We sat there for a long time, holding that journal as if it were a sacred relic, the last voice of a man who saw death coming but couldn't stop it. I stood. "We need help." She nodded. "Whatever it takes, Brandon, we're going to finish what he started." The next morning, I made 2 calls. The first was to Leon Briggs, a private investigator recommended by an old colleague. He was retired law enforcement, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, and had a reputation for pulling truths out of shadows. The second was to Rachel Stern, a criminal attorney I'd met during a startup legal workshop. She was known for her steel resolve and brilliant casework. Both agreed to meet that evening at my mother's house. Leon arrived first, tall, gruff, wearing a faded leather coat that smelled like cigar smoke and stubbornness. Rachel came 20 minutes later, crisp and professional in a navy blazer, carrying a thick binder under one arm. We sat in the living room, the same room where Victor once ruled with silence and suspicion. Now it was a war room. I placed my grandfather's journal on the table. Rachel skimmed it quickly, her eyes narrowing. "This is more than enough to open an inquiry," she said. Leon nodded. "If your grandfather's symptoms match known poisoning effects, and there's a pattern with you too, then this isn't a coincidence, it's a cover-up. But it happened over 20 years ago," I said. "Isn't it too late?" "Not necessarily," Leon said. "If there's enough suspicion, we can petition for an exhumation and autopsy. Sedatives like barbiturates can leave residual traces in bone tissue, especially if the concentration was high." The thought chilled me, digging up my grandfather's grave. But I also knew, if he was poisoned, it was the only way to give him justice. Rachel took a deep breath. "I'll file the paperwork. It won't be easy, but with the journal and your lab report, we have probable cause." Within a week we had a court date. My mother and I sat side by side on the bench, fingers entwined. She hadn't spoken to Victor since the night of the confrontation. He had tried calling, left voicemails, but she ignored them all. He was still under the illusion he could fix this, that we'd sweep it under the rug like every mistake he ever made. But this time, we had matches, we had gasoline, and we were ready to light it. The court granted our request. The exhumation was scheduled for early the following week. That weekend, I visited the cemetery alone. I stood over Grandpa Samuel's resting place, the November wind tugging at my coat. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "You deserved better than this. I promise I won't stop until they know what really happened to you." 3 days later, the lab results came back. High traces of phenobarbital, a potent sedative, consistent with the wine sample my father had tried to serve me. A lethal dose. Rachel slammed the folder shut. "We're filing criminal charges." Leon didn't flinch. "We'll also reopen the financial trail. If Victor inherited anything from Samuel's estate through forged means, we'll find it." My mother said nothing. She sat quietly, holding the notebook in her lap. Her face was pale but fierce. This wasn't just about me anymore, or even about Grandpa Samuel. It was about every lie Victor had built our family on, and we were ready to tear it down. The day we filed charges against Victor Bennett, I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired, heavy, because it wasn't just my father standing trial. It was decades of silence, manipulation, and wounds that never had names. Rachel prepared everything with laser precision. The file we submitted was thick, lab results from both wine samples, Grandpa Samuel's autopsy report, handwriting analyses comparing the forged inheritance documents, and the journal that had set everything in motion. Victor was served 3 days later. Attempted murder for what he did to me, first-degree murder for poisoning my grandfather, fraud for forging estate documents and stealing a legacy that was never his. He pleaded not guilty, of course, claimed everything was a misunderstanding, that I was exaggerating, that my mother was unstable, that I'd been poisoned elsewhere, probably from one of your lavish Seattle parties. He spat in the pre-trial hearing, but no one was buying it, especially not the judge. The trial was set for mid-February, cold grey skies, heavy tension. My mother and I arrived early on the first day, sitting side by side in the front row. She wore a simple black coat and a lavender brooch, Grandpa's favorite flower. I wore a navy suit, the same one I wore the night Victor tried to kill me. Victor sat across the courtroom, his once dominant posture now sagging. His eyes darted between the defense attorney and the floor. He looked smaller, older, but not remorseful, just cornered. The prosecution opened with the lab report on the wine. The toxicologist testified the amount of barbiturate present would render a man unconscious within minutes, possibly fatal without immediate medical care. Then came the autopsy results from Grandpa Samuel's exhumed remains. It was never a heart attack, the forensic pathologist said. He was poisoned, When the journal entry was read aloud, Grandpa's own words, suspecting Victor of intending harm, people in the courtroom gasped. Victor buried his face in his hands, but the final blow was delivered by Rachel. She stood and revealed the forged documents. A handwriting expert confirmed the inconsistencies, and then she said, "We have one more witness." She called my mother to the stand. My heart clenched as I watched her walk to the witness chair, shoulders squared, chin high. She spoke clearly, steadily, about the birthday party, about the 2 times she saw the symptoms, once in her son, once in her father, about the cold marriage, the secrets, the control, and finally she said, "I didn't want to believe it, but I watched my son collapse. I saw my husband stand over him without fear or urgency, and I knew something was wrong. No mother could look away from that truth. When she stepped down, I stood and held her hand. She looked at me with tears in her eyes, but didn't cry. Victor didn't take the stand. The jury didn't need long. Guilty on all counts. When the judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole, Victor didn't react. No anger, no denial, just silence. The same silence he'd used to rule our home. But this time, it didn't scare me. This time, it was over. It's been 8 months since the trial. Victor is behind bars, serving a life sentence. The media had a field day. Prominent businessman convicted in shocking family poison plot. But eventually the headlines faded. We didn't speak his name again. Instead, my mother and I focused on something we hadn't known for years: peace. She moved into a small townhouse in the quieter part of San Francisco, near Golden Gate Park. The backyard was modest, a patch of grass, a stone path and a raised flower bed, but she transformed it into a small garden, lavender, rosemary, heirloom roses. She said she liked having something to nurture that didn't hurt her in return. I visited often, sometimes every weekend. We'd sit on the porch with mugs of chamomile tea, watching the sun dip behind the trees. We didn't need to talk much anymore. Just being in the same place, feeling safe, that was enough. I returned to my consulting work in tech, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. It felt good to build again, on my own terms. But every once in a while, late at night, I'd look at the framed journal page I kept in my study. Grandpa Samuel's last entry, the one where he wrote he suspected something was wrong. He didn't get to see justice, but we gave it to him, and in doing so, we reclaimed something for ourselves too. One Saturday, as we were pruning the lavender, my mother looked at me and said quietly, "You saved my life, Brandon, not just from Victor, but from myself." I'd forgotten how to believe in anything. I looked at her hands, once trembling, now steady. "You saved mine too," I said. "The scars are still there, of course. Some wounds run deeper than others, but we've stopped pretending they don't exist, and that in itself is healing. We are not the family we once were, but we are finally a family." On my birthday this year, I hosted a small dinner, just my mother, a couple close friends and Rachel, who brought flowers and insisted on making the dessert herself. We toasted quietly, and I looked around at the candlelight dancing on gentle faces. No tension, no secrets, just warmth. I stood and raised my glass. "To beginnings," I said, and for the first time in a very long time I meant it.